It is wonderful to be here today. As I started preparing for this lecture, I realized that our institutions have a similar origin story. The Chautauqua Institution was founded for Sunday school teachers, and the Carter Center was founded by Sunday school teachers. In fact, President Carter taught Sunday school for his entire life, whether he was a business owner or whether he was a governor, president, Nobel laureate, or part of the Carter Center as an NGO leader, he always took time to teach the gospel. For him, he believed that some missions were sacred, including yours. So as President Carter shared Teddy Roosevelt's opinion that Chautauqua is the most American thing in America, he knew that standing in public and sharing ideas could sometimes get you in trouble, arrested, or in some places worse. And to him, the stage wasn't just the essence of America, it actually was the embodiment of America. And we shouldn't be afraid to say if American democracy has a home, it might be the stage at Chautauqua. So it's a lesson that President Carter learned from a woman named Julia Coleman. Miss Julia, as she was known, had one of the most important jobs in America. She was a teacher. And for 5 decades, she taught high school in the town of Plains, Georgia. 400 people, a single block business district, no stoplights. It's the same today as it was then when she taught a boy named Jimmy. And Miss Julia took it as her actual sacred mission in life to make sure her students were inspired, informed, and intellectually curious. She wanted them to engage in the world and ask questions. She wanted them to be curious about democracy, about justice, about citizenship, about the rule of law. And even though they were far from the famous stages of Atlanta and elsewhere, she wanted to bring those messages home. She brought back literature and dance and all of the different pieces of creativity in all its forms. So to carry out that sacred mission, to teach her high school students this, she went to a magical place every year. And the magical place had a name, and it was Chautauqua. So from the early 1920s until through the 1950s, Julia Coleman came to Chautauqua assemblies, and she brought back to Plains, Georgia, many Chautauqua camps. So 3 generations at Plains High School actually had the opportunity to learn about citizenship, patriotism, and community service. And those lessons eventually became so renowned that Eleanor Roosevelt invited Miss Julia to the White House. And she used to tell her students, study hard because you never know when someone in this classroom might be President of the United States. And so, wouldn't you know it, one of them turned out to be president, and Miss Julia was so influential in Jimmy Carter's life that the 3rd line of his inaugural address when he was president were her words of wisdom. We must adjust to changing times, but still hold true to unchanging principles. And it wasn't only President Carter that called Miss Julia the best teacher he had. Rosalynn Carter, who was a freshman at the school at the same time, also felt that way. And 2 decades ago, she established a Chautauqua program in Plains for the residents of Plains that still goes on today. So these 2 remarkable people, Jimmy and Rosalynn Carter, steeped in the spirit of Chautauqua, and as they used to say, after the involuntary retirement from the White House in 1980, they decided to establish what they felt was like a mini Camp David. So they established the Carter Center in Atlanta, Georgia, and it initially was conceived of to follow basic human rights and to be a place where you could resolve conflict without having the US government moniker on it, but it was a neutral place. And after a while, the portfolio of peace programs grew, and it started to include basic health programs. Because President Carter and Mrs. Carter saw in Plains, Georgia, at the end of the road in southwest Georgia, the same thing that they saw at the end of the road in other countries when they were traveling in the presidency. And they wanted to address those people at the end of the road. So that's what I mean when I say we share origin stories. You can draw a direct line from those initial Chautauqua Sunday school teachers 150 years ago to Miss Julia Coleman to the Carter Center today. And so It's striking and a little bit surreal that I am up here today talking to you about an issue that dominated the political discussions that Miss Julia led for 5 decades in Plains, Georgia. She and her students looked at an early 20th century ravaged by authoritarianism in a hope that the title of Sinclair Lewis's 1935 book, It Can't Happen Here, was actually true. Yet, 90 years later, the storm clouds of authoritarianism are growing, and we're forced to reckon with the question and the ghost of Sinclair Lewis: can it actually happen here? And if you think the answer is no, I will be very interested in our Q&A session or talking to you. But at the Carter Center, we actually think the answer is yes. So today I want to talk to you about why we consider the rise of authoritarianism and the backsliding of democracy to be the greatest threat facing the world today. And more than that, I want to talk to you about the unshakable belief that President and Mrs. Carter had in the power of ordinary people to actually turn back that tide, to resist and to ultimately renew our democracy. And so to President Carter, justice and democracy weren't just ideals. They were daily acts of courage and daily acts of faith. And so however daunting something seemed, he never allowed himself to get lost in despair, because he knew that his faith was stronger than his doubt, and his faith in the American people was actually even stronger. And that's a faith I think we all share. So I'm here this morning to tell you something you already know. What is happening today isn't us. It isn't what America is all about. And it isn't how our story ends. And by the end of our time together, I hope that you will take not only comfort, but you will also find some motivation to actually act. So, how do we adjust to changing times and hold true to unchanging principles? Glad that's the topic of today's discussion. So, before I go any further, I need to be very clear and make a confession. I'm not an academic. I have not written books on authoritarianism. I do not teach classes. And I don't have a degree in this area, but I have seen it up close. I've lived it. I've spent 3 decades working in global development, in 2 stints as a Senate-confirmed person, head of USAID and 2 regional bureaus. USAID. A moment, please. I moved to Czechoslovakia back when it was one country, Czechoslovakia. I cut my teeth in the Balkans, working on so many areas during the war and in the post-conflict era. And I then moved to the Middle East and North Africa and worked during the Arab Spring. And so I watched a lot of countries transition from authoritarianism to democracy. And before that, I had worked in global development throughout maternal and child health care. I've monitored elections from Fulton County to Ukraine, and I've seen programs that bring the end of disease to places at the end of the road. And so, although I don't have a PhD, I do have world experience, and it did not require extended tuition payments. So I'm glad that I was invited here, even though I don't have that title. So I have seen up close the difference that America can make in the lives of people worldwide. And I have also witnessed the love and the loyalty that foreign aid creates for the United States in ways that bombs and tanks rarely do. I've also seen every form of government up close, and I understand why Winston Churchill said that democracy is the worst form of government, except for every other form of government. So I think it's easy to forget exactly how rare democracy is. It is not the norm. It's a relatively recent and fragile achievement. And of the thousands of societies that have existed throughout human history, authoritarianism and its more sinister cousins, fascism, communism, totalitarianism, military dictatorship, those have actually been the standards. And whether you were a servant in ancient Rome or a peasant indentured to a warlord in 11th century China or a laborer in 18th century England, you were never thought of as a citizen, only a subject. You didn't have free will, and you had very little real opportunity. So only a small fraction of the world has ever tried to govern themselves by laws, by free and fair elections. No single country in the world had really tried to do this before. And when we do it, we believe that no one is above the law. So it's astonishing that when Miss Julia Coleman started teaching, there wasn't a single country in the world that would qualify as a full democracy by today's standards. And so before the US entered World War II, there were just 12 democracies in the world. And in the US, we still refuse to allow black people to vote in 1 of every 5 countries. So this is still a very new phenomenon, but I know I'm probably not the only person here who remembers when the Freedom House Index came out in 2000, and it counted 120 democracies in the world. That was 63% of the planet that lived under democracy. And that, to me, was an amazing time. It was the greatest percentage that we had ever had in the world. And every single one of those societies had been tested by war and by inequality and by the rise of authoritarian leaders who promised strength, but they pursued domination. And then these people would concentrate the power and the leader, and it was always a him, and that's a whole nother main stage discussion about the male-dominated field that we live in, but it always came down to concentrating power for them. And so as we've seen from the brilliant speakers who have been on this stage before me, we're living through a test right now. And authoritarianism has shifted from the fringe of global politics back to the core. And I prefer telling stories than using numbers, but sometimes numbers do actually tell the story. So like this one, for the first time in 2 decades, the largest global database said democracies found that there were more autocracies in the world than democracies. And a staggering 72% of the world's population, so that's more than 5.7 billion people, now live under full authoritarian rule or a hybrid, like in China and Russia. And Freedom House reported last year that the global freedoms had declined for the 19th consecutive year, with 60 countries declining and only 34 increasing. And the cherry on top of that very bitter sundae is that this goes alongside the most severe decline in credible elections that we've seen. And so since 2008, we've had a 10% decline in voter turnout. So all of this bonded together, when Americans talk about authoritarianism, we often point our finger outward. It's Venezuela. It's any of the 10 countries that Javier Corrales put up before on Tuesday. But now we're haunted by the ghost of Sinclair Lewis. Could this actually happen here? And until 2016, the Democracy Index classified the United States as a full democracy. But now we're classified as a flawed democracy. We're ranked 27th in the world. And the number that was recorded to put us as 27th was actually before our new president. So it's a little wonder that 80% of Americans report either being very or somewhat concerned about the state of our democracy, and with half of our fellow citizens worrying that we face the real danger of becoming a non-democratic authoritarian country. I mean, just sit on that. Like, half of Americans believe this. So this is going to make for some very odd birthday banners at our 250th anniversary next year, because this is the direction that our fellow Americans see us going in. But we are not alone. Yasha Monk and Roberta Foa did a landmark study that took 50 years of social science research, 4 million respondents in 150 countries, and they found that over the past half a century, satisfaction with democracy has fallen across the democratic world. And for the first time ever, more people are dissatisfied with democracy than satisfied. And the worst numbers were in the countries that you would expect to be the best: Europe, North Asia, North America, and especially in the United States. But for all the critiques of American exceptionalism, we've always taken pride in the fact that we are optimistic people and that we are more confident and optimistic than the rest of the world. But David Brooks just did a study, and as he tells it, 59% of Americans say our country is in decline. 69% of Americans believe that the political and economic elite don't care about hardworking people. So of these and dozens of other statements, Americans are no longer the most optimistic. we're just as disheartened as the rest of the world. And that's depressing to think about because we are an optimistic people. But at these moments, I remember the title of President Carter's first book, An Hour Before Daylight. And so for me, I like to think that we are in the dark, but we are an hour before daylight. So what I have to say specifically is about the deterioration we are now facing came as a personal surprise to me. I left public service having served for 25 years under 3 different presidents, and we followed our son to Amsterdam because he got a wonderful opportunity to play soccer, and we thought we would use our get out of jail for free card and take a pre-retirement year or so in the Netherlands. So I took a job working at an NGO that worked with farmers to help them grow what they could sell, not just sell what they were growing, and we would link them to markets. And there were certain markets like Heineken that wanted to locally source their raw material to actually work with the communities that they were serving as opposed to constantly bringing things in from abroad. So I saw firsthand corporate social responsibility in action. I saw what it did when farmers were able to sell their goods, when they could buy more land, they could buy a house, they could send their kids to school. All of this is exactly what we had wanted to see. So I was surprised, pleasantly surprised, when I got the call in the middle of our time in Never Never Land, as we called it, to come back, consider interviewing for the CEO job at the Carter Center. Now, Atlanta was home for me. I had not lived there since I graduated high school, and so it was a wonderful opportunity. So I arrived back on June 1st, 2020. Everyone try to remember what you were doing on June 1st, 2020. We were 5 months into COVID, or a few months into COVID. I was greeted when I got off the plane by the Center for Disease Control asking if I had been to Iran or China lately. And I thought, but I'm coming from Europe. We've flattened the curve. Everyone here wore a mask or socially distanced, and things were opening, and I was entering the viral soup of Georgia. My brother picked me up at the airport, and we drove down Peachtree Street, and I saw the aftermath of the protests from that weekend of the murder of George Floyd. And I got to my parents' house, and they were, of course, popping champagne because the prodigal daughter was finally home. And I could see on the TV what was happening, that Lafayette Square was being tear-gassed for a photo op. And so there were a lot of tears that night at my parents' house, looking at some of my parents' friends, because I was home, but my parents were crying tears of joy, and I was crying because I was bringing my son and my husband back to this country, and I didn't know what to expect. So to say, in some ways, I didn't recognize the people or the place that America had become. After having the distance from the US, it was truly dystopian to see people talking to each other this way, how polarized we had become, attacking each other on television and in social media. But what I really noticed was a week later when I saw the lines for the presidential primary in Fulton County, Georgia, that were 5 hours long. I mean, Americans are not built to wait in line for 5 hours in June in Georgia heat. And so here I was about to take on an organization that had worked on 125 elections in 40 different countries, and yet I wasn't sure we were doing it right in our own country. And so how could we point fingers at Venezuelans that they weren't doing it if we were having these lines? So I went down to Plains, Georgia to visit President and Mrs. Carter, and I had a conversation with them, and I said, I'm sitting in their small living room in the ranch house from 1961 that he had built and that they retired to back in 1981, and I said to this incredibly frugal man, what are you saving your money for? And he said, a rainy day. And I said, it's pouring outside. I don't know how I can run an organization and go and try to find the Koch brothers and the Soros Foundation to prove that we are nonpartisan so we can do the same type of election work in the US about election integrity, not who's going to win or lose, but about the integrity of the election. I don't have time to raise that money. So he said it was okay, I could spend some of our endowment earnings, but just a little bit, he said. And so I recognize the best place to start is usually in your own community. So I came back to Georgia, and I came back to Atlanta, and I called Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, and people probably know his name, and I was not the call, and the reason why you know his name, that was a different phone call altogether. But we talked about how elections were run, and we both knew that the night of the election, you might actually see one group win, and the next morning, when the bigger counties report out, you'll see another group. And at that point, everyone freaks out, and they start questioning the elections. And so we all remember the year 2000, when we all went to bed thinking that Al Gore was going to be our next president, and then we spent 36 excruciating days watching hanging chads being counted and watching court cases play out before we as Americans knew who our next president was. So fast forward 20 years, it was quite clear to me that we were going to see questions about our voting machines and the integrity of our election. You know, just 2 years before, Stacey Abrams had refused to concede that she had lost the race for governor. So Georgia was kind of primed for this example. So together with the Secretary of State's office, we worked with them on something called a risk-limiting audit. And that was truly just to limit the risk that the votes counted would be different than the actual votes. So there was a paper ballot that was part of the QR code that went into the machine that counted the ballot. So we were able to look at this. There are 159 counties in Georgia. The only state with more counties than that is Texas. And we were able to get 60% of the votes. So there were 5.5 million people who voted in Georgia. And we watched that risk-limiting audit. And I could have been in Ukraine. I could have been anywhere in the world watching it. It was people doing their civic duty to recount the votes, to make sure that your vote, every person's vote, counted. And it was also like watching paint dry, because if you've been a poll worker or done any of that, it's not terribly exciting. But what we came up with at the end was the fact that the difference, the variance, was within human error. It was 0.0099% between the QR code and the paper ballot. So you would have thought, as independent, neutral, nonpartisan observers, with partisan observers allowed to also watch it, and it was live streamed, that there would be no question. Yet, our report said it was by the book, the safest election Georgia had ever run, and yet the President of the United States contested the vote. That's when he made the famous phone call to Brad Raffensperger and asked to find 11,000 votes. And so the legitimacy of America's election had never been questioned until that moment. The bedrock of our democracy has always been a peaceful transfer of power. Without that, everything begins to unravel. So, yet here we are, 60 court cases later, and half the country still believes that the 2020 election was stolen. So it's hard to know where to work from there. So when you recognize that we have this notion that democracy dies in darkness, as the Washington Post masthead says, we had lots of reasons to believe in the 20th century that authoritarian came around at the end of a gun, at the end of a tank, or through a deadly military coup, which with one big cataclysmic event, because that's what we had seen happen in so many countries. Think of Germany collapsing under the bloodthirsty war machine of Hitler, or think of the presidential palace in Chile being bombed, courtesy of America, in 1973, when an avowed Marxist was in power, and he died by suicide after addressing the country. And within a day, one regime had changed into what ended up being a right-wing dictatorship. And that began in Argentina. 30,000 people went missing or disappeared and were killed during the Dirty War. And when I was there last month, still talking to mothers and grandmothers who have no idea where their children are, and you see the scars of a generation of people, even people my age, who didn't go out at night because they were so afraid. And think of how the Khmer Rouge managed the systemic persecution and killing of nearly 25% of the Cambodian population, or 800,000 Tutsis were killed in a matter of 3 months by Rwandan Hutus, or how Slobodan Milosevic wanted to create a greater Serbia by ethnically cleansing Bosnia and Croatia of their identity. So the unconscionable invasion of Ukraine. I could keep going on in this, but authoritarianism does not always happen with jackboots and tanks. It can come wearing a tie or waving a flag and promising order, identity, and greatness. So rather than crossing bright lines, it normalizes pushing boundaries. And I've seen this firsthand in numerous countries where I have worked, as we have across history. So it's a process where democracy isn't abolished overnight, but rather dismantled from the inside out, like a Trojan horse, through the erosion of norms, the hollowing out of civic institutions, and the abandonment of long-time customs, often positioned as an effort to improve democracy. So we've seen it in Hungary, where the former US patron, Prime Minister Viktor Orban, started as a reformer. He spent 4 years working as a reformer, and then abruptly took a right turn and dismantled democratic institutions while he consolidated power. We've seen it in Turkey, where Erdogan started as a reformer, and then after a failed coup, he purged journalists, teachers, civil servants. He purged professors, and he wanted to rewrite the rules of history so he may be in power indefinitely. We've seen it in Russia with Vladimir Putin, where he promised to restore Russians' dignity, but then he co-opted the media, he invaded a neighboring country, and then in Venezuela, as Javier discussed, it was once a thriving democracy, and it fell under the spell of Hugo Chavez, who initially had been a former union leader, turned authoritarianism, and forcing millions of people to leave Venezuela, and that has continued under the current president, Nicolas Maduro. But for that matter, we can also look at ancient Rome. Julius Caesar didn't seize power in a day. He portrayed himself as a champion of the common Roman, and he wanted to defy the elites, and he blamed the corrupt Senate, and then he marched on Rome. He crossed the Rubicon. He entered the city with his army, shattering 5 centuries of tradition to never bring the military troops into the capital. So the people cheered, and then civil war started, and then institutions crumbled, and then the republic died. So one of the greatest misconceptions we have about authoritarianism is that it's an ideology, but it's not. It's actually a strategy. It's a style of rule that revolves around one man, again, guided entirely by his whims and his ego and his survival. And every single one of these nations followed the exact same pattern. Authoritarian leaders start with populist slogans. They claim to represent the people. They speak of returning the nation to former greatness, which was somehow stolen from them. But over time, the definition of the people changes. It shrinks. It becomes synonymous with the leader himself, who demands complete loyalty to himself and not the Constitution. To support him is patriotic. To defy him is treason. And the authoritarian steps are always the same. Some call it a playbook, and I think of them as tactics. Since they don't always happen in sequence, sometimes they can happen concurrently or in various different orders, but the strategy is always the same. So here are the 7 authoritarian tactics. 1, you delegitimize the press. You call it fake news. You accuse the media of lying. You sue those who run bad stories. And if people can't trust facts, then truth becomes what you say it is. 2, you politicize the elite and the independent institutions. You replace civil servants with loyalists. You attack the judiciary. You call judges who rule against you corrupt. You attack universities, law firms, nonprofits, and opposition political parties as enemies of the people. And you eliminate checks and balances. 3, you co-opt the military and the police. You praise violence and support those who act outside the law. You make top law enforcement officials answerable to you, preferably because they couldn't have gotten the job if it weren't for you. 4, you quash dissent by limiting what can be taught, said, and read, going so far as to review social media accounts to make sure that you punish anyone who says anything bad about you. 5, you scapegoat the other. You turn on immigrants, you turn on vulnerable targets like minorities and dissidents, and you claim that the people should either blame them or fear them, because only I can protect you. 6, you undermine elections. When that happens, when you claim the system is rigged, even before the elections happen, you cast doubt on the results and you refuse to accept the loss that's in front of you. And 7, once in power, you rewrite the laws so that rules don't apply to you and you never have to leave. So these are the 7 authoritarian tactics, and they've been followed faithfully by everyone from Mussolini to Franco to Lukashenko to Putin. And if they sound familiar to you, it really is no accident, because we've seen these tactics followed to the letter in Washington in the past 6 months. It's been reminiscent of what Lenin said, that sometimes there are decades where nothing happens, and sometimes there are weeks where decades happen. So I probably don't have to recount this to you, but in the first 30 days, there was a blizzard of executive orders. They consolidated and expanded executive power. They disregarded the rule of law and due process, hollowed out the civil service and replaced it with loyalists, defied rulings of an independent judiciary, scapegoat and dehumanize everyone who looks different or sounds different, and removes all guardrails between the public service and personal wealth. And all this was done while attacking and delegitimizing every possible means of dissent and accountability, from Congress to the free press, to universities, to our allies, to scientists, to cultural institutions, to medicine, to Rosie O'Donnell. So perhaps you believe this change was needed, and while stark, it might have been necessary, but I think we can all agree that it's no ordinary time we're living in. So take a moment and just imagine that there's a country with a heavily armed militia wearing homemade black hoods and no badges. They pull people out of their homes and their workplaces in the middle of the day without any evidence or due process. They send them to makeshift detention centers or ship them to other countries where they might be disappeared forever. And then imagine reading that this government is so pleased with what they've done that they've passed a massive budget bill to make the militia the largest enforcement body in the country, offering young men 5-figure salaries and 6-figure bonuses when they could only get a fraction of that in the workforce. So, of course, you know what I'm talking about. It's the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. And it's a highly paid secret terror squad that helped plunge the country into darkness more than 3 decades ago. But I could just as easily be talking about the oprichniki created by Tsar Ivan the Terrible in the 16th century Russia. I could be talking about the brown shirts in Germany or any of the 100 other secret militias that terrorized countries going back to antiquity. All of them had one thing in common. They were well-paid foot soldiers who answered solely to the violent vision of one person. Now, I realize that's very dark, and I promise I'll come to a happier place, but I'm not suggesting that America is there and that we're going down that road, but none of these countries thought they were there either until they were. In every case, it went from the impossible to the inevitable to the horrifying in no time at all. So, why does authoritarianism work? Because during times of uncertainty, there's a great appeal for an all-powerful leader, a decider who can cut through any of the bureaucracy and the obstacles without having to deal with endless compromise to solve problems that seem to require urgent action. I used to hear it all the time when I lived in Prague. People would say, well, at least under authoritarianism, things got done. And you could see that for sure, the trains ran on time, the streets were clean, and protesters don't cause traffic jams in the middle of the road. But autocrats can do just what needs to be done while steamrolling anyone who gets in their way. President Bill Clinton used to say, when people feel uncertainty, they'd rather have someone strong and wrong than weak and right. So why does authoritarianism have such appeal right now? Well, it's either because every leader in every liberal democracy across the world suddenly forgot how to govern all at the exact same time, or there are greater forces that are bearing down on us, and they transcend borders in ways that no single country can address. And maybe it has something to do with our seeming inability to solve any problem. During the time we live in, you have to think about the fact that we have gone through a once-in-a-century pandemic that fractured lives and supply chains and made us feel like we had little or no control. We have had global political realignment, wars in Europe and the Middle East, and growing distrust of global institutions. We've had a technological revolution. You can look at AI as either it's going to save humanity or it's going to take all of our jobs. You're looking at climate change, where it seems to deliver 1,000-year storms in every month. You look at chronically punishing economy, where persistent inflation and interest rates shocks everyone, high rents, mortgage payments. You look at mass migration, which is happening, that strains borders and all of our national infrastructure, and by the growing sense that the center is not holding, and that our shared narratives, our institutions and social fabrics are fraying. Excuse me, it's not just disruption, it's dislocation. And depending on your age, you may or may not see democracy as the answer. Excuse me. Yasha Monk and Roberta Foa, the study I talked about, they also found that 75% of Americans born before World War II think democracy is essential. That's amazing because only 30% of Gen Zs and millennials actually think that democracy is essential. And so when you're looking at statistics like that, it's not just a US phenomenon, it's worldwide, and you simply can't maintain this idea and project of self-government for free and equal citizens if the rising generations don't actually believe in it. So the promise of authoritarianism is simplicity and certainty. As long as you don't mind having zero say in how you're governed by governments that can hide abuses because there's no expectation of transparency, of rule of law or due process, the appeal to autocracy is predictability. And that was brought home to me after I was in China earlier this year, talking to a number of Beijing scholars. And I, of course, said, whatever America is saying about China is not about you, it's about us. And their response was interesting. They said, oh, we feel sorry for you Americans because we know what's expected of us. We do it, and that's understood, and we get rewarded for it. But you Americans think that you have all this space to work, and you forget that the state controls so much of certain things. And so that's the problem with you Americans. And I don't know about you, but I never like another country to say the problem with you Americans. But it was eye-opening to me, and because if you don't have a preconceived notion of the opportunities available in a democracy, it's not hard to see how the authoritarian model can be attractive, because it's a very simple formula. You do this, you get that. Nothing less, nothing more. And for many, that's thought to be enough. So I saw it in Prague when we would walk into restaurants and you would see a group of waiters sitting in the corner smoking cigarettes, and all of the tables would have reserve signs on it. And it didn't take me long to realize, after I asked if there was a table and they'd say no, you realize that they had a contract with the state. They would come and they would do work, and they would get paid, and they would have their health care paid, and they didn't work for tips. So they really had no reason to do that work. So it was a moment where I realized, within Czechoslovakia, as I saw so many people trying to figure out firsthand how a generation goes from transitioning from having the state think and decide to having them have to think and decide. There was also a shop that I would walk into, and it sold cheese, one kind of cheese, Sear. It was just the cheese you bought. And then when the world opened up, there were 6 kinds of cheeses. And I would go in, and the lines would be long because everyone was paralyzed with choice. Suddenly, they didn't know what cheese to buy because they were no longer being offered just one cheese. So it took a while for the work ethic to catch up. It took a while for people to catch on. And it was a running joke that people would say, we pretended to work and the regime pretended to pay us. And so that's how these countries under communism had worked. So in places where the worst backsliding actually occurred, those expectations were never met. The younger generation thought it could step in and they could figure it out. But they often couldn't because, in large part, the system couldn't evolve fast enough to meet their needs. So in places like China and Russia, they ended up reverting back to the old ways of repression. State control be damned. So it also reminds me of a number of stories that I've heard from previously incarcerated people. They were so used to their days being planned, being dictated to them, and the choices being made for them that they had a hard time reintegrating into society. Prison isn't better, obviously, than freedom, but in a most sinister way, it's actually simpler. It's what tyranny feeds on, and in many ways, what Americans of every political stripe are feeling today. The average Americans are not necessarily looking for a change. They don't want a fundamentally different system. They just want the system to work in an era where every single thing around them seems uncertain. Thank you. So now that I've thoroughly probably depressed you, I want to move it up a little bit because that is how authoritarianism happens. But here's what we also know. Authoritarian regimes rot from the inside out. Why? Because when you kill dissent, you kill ideas. And when one person or one party decides what's best for everyone without questioning or an election, you don't get order. You get fear. You get stagnation. You get a whole lot of bad ideas going on unchallenged. Just as we've seen in North Korea or the Russians, the Iranians, they used to live in one of the most modern and exciting countries in the world until they didn't. On its face, China seems to be the exception until you remember its people lack some very basic single personal liberties. And authoritarianism promises order, but it delivers fear. It tells you, we will protect you right up until you are the ones that need protection from others. And I'm really haunted by something that, if anyone has visited the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., there's something on the wall there that was written by Reverend Martin Niemöller. And it says, first they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I didn't speak out because I was a trade unionist. And then they came for the Jews, and I didn't speak out because I wasn't a Jew. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. And, you know, I will say, here's what Miss Julia learned at Chautauqua. She learned the secret that every successful democracy isn't just free elections, it's free speech, it's freedom of religion, it's a free press, it's an independent judiciary. It's people who can think and act for themselves. It's a civil society full of nonprofits, of misfits, of unions, of artists, of cranky voters. It's democracies that happen over centuries. Democracies have always outperformed autocracies. And there's a wonderful UN happiness study that is out there that talks about the fact that Finland, as a democracy, is the happiest country in the world, followed not too long after by Mexico, which is 10th. The United States is 24th, right between UK and Brazil, where we all vacation at some point or another. So meanwhile, Russia ranks 66th, China 68, Turkey 94, and Iran 99. So even though it feels like it's in short supply in America today, we are a free society, and free societies always report a higher satisfaction, more trust in their neighbors, and a greater optimism about the future. So my own experiences, people sing, they dance, they create more than they do in autocracies. But of course, if you're one of the 25% of Americans who actually was trying to borrow money last week to make sure they could get groceries, or one of the 50% of Americans who say they are one crisis away from homelessness, maybe singing and dancing really aren't your priorities. But the America that we are seeing now, it doesn't just lack empathy, but where cruelty seems to be the point, is not us. It's certainly not what America voted for, and it isn't going to be how our story ends. So it's easy to see that authoritarianism is surging, and to think that humanity is defaulting back to a time before human rights and rule of law and civil liberties, to think that democracy is in retreat, and there's nothing we can do about it. But none of this is inevitable. At the end of the day, history isn't just a story of decline. It's also a story of brave people who stand up against the odds, who stand against tyranny, and protect the rights of all people. In our own country, we've made it through authoritarianism before, from slavery to segregation, from McCarthyism to mass surveillance. Jimmy Carter himself was born in an America that had seen perhaps the greatest threat to constitutional rights in our history before and after the First World War. It was a time when the government shut down 75 different magazines and newspapers it found critical of the war effort. It threw more than 1,000 Americans in prison for things that they wrote or that they said, and it had a 250,000-person protective league that arrested or roughed up anybody who it deemed disloyal to the United States. So America in those years saw an authoritarianism that a historian has said only the current resident of the White House could dream about. So yet America made it through. We made it through just as South Korea did when they managed to have a massive peaceful protest to the impeachment, and were able to impeach an authoritarian president and restore democratic norms. And Malawi made it through after a 2020 election when its court overthrew a fraudulent election. Citizens organized and the opposition united, and the democracy prevailed. And Chile made it through those Pinochet years with a powerful message of no. The No campaign used humor, it used comic strips, pop culture, and a really hopeful vision of what the public could imagine. And 56% of people voted against Pinochet at the top of his term in power. The dictatorship ended, democracy prevailed, and today Freedom House scores Chile as 94 out of 100 in political rights and civil liberties, making it one of the freest countries in Latin America. So yes, good for Chileans. So in every case, democracy was restored. And in every case when it was restored, it was because people organized. People stood up and said, enough. And it can happen in Chile and South Korea and Malawi and Serbia. It can happen in the United States of America, wherever you might call home. So there is this one bug in democracy, and it's a bug in our system, and that people can occasionally vote in a tyrant, but in authoritarianism, tyranny is a permanent state. It's a permanent feature. And democracy's greatest strength is that it holds within itself, through the ballot box, the possibility of self-renewal. And that's been a message that the Carter Center has had since the day it was founded. When people organize around a worthy cause, democracy might face a reckoning, but it can also face a rebirth. President Carter, if he were here today, I think he would say that he'd have a very simple message. He would say, if you're concerned about the future of democracy, do not get lost in your own despair, because the answer is not to retreat. The answer is to resist. So what does this look like in practice? I know that you've heard from other speakers, and I'm not going to say make sure you vote, although you should definitely vote, because you have to start on the ground you already stand on, using your voice to speak out. The political scientist Eric Chenoweth, and I know Selena talked about this, has shown that in nonviolent protests, they're twice as likely to succeed as violent protests and armed conflicts. And those that have engaged in them, at a 3.5% of the population, have never failed to bring about change. Just 3.5% of the population who says, no, Not now, not here, and there's a better way. So it does mean voting in every election, especially local elections where change happens at the community level. It means calling out disinformation when you see it. You need to learn to discern what you're reading, what you're hearing, what people are sending to you to make sure it's factual. You need to work with having hard conversations with your neighbors, with your family, because without those conversations, if we don't listen to each other, we're never going to hear what the other person is saying. It means keeping those conversations going through working with civil society organizations, supporting strong nonprofits that are helping to train journalists, those that are working on human rights issues and supporting democracy studies, and enlisting the private sector. I mentioned the work we did with Heineken. I had never seen corporate social responsibility up close. There's a private sector here that now needs to lean in on corporate social responsibility. It also means cultivating and protecting the remaining allies that we have within government and those working in non-political spaces. Congressman John Lewis used to say that democracy is not a state, it's an act. And every generation has to learn in a new way the right to say we the people, we America, we one nation under whatever God you believe in. And that's what it means to adjust to changing times and to hold true to unchanging principles. It's much like if your heart goes on bypass or if you're wearing a cast on your arm, you can't let everything else atrophy. You have to keep those muscles moving. So when these things come back online, when your heart works again and your cast is taken off, there is something else there that you can lean on so everyone can move forward. I will tell you, and I'll say President Carter had this wonderful quote with the Indian Parliament. He said, the experience of democracy is like the experience of life itself. It's always changing. It's infinite in its variety. It's sometimes turbulent and all the more valuable for having been tested by adversity. So, everyone here has had your own version of Julia Coleman to get involved in civic life in this nation, or you probably wouldn't be here. So I'm going to close by telling you about the person who inspired me. I'm going to try to do this without tears. The person who inspired me actually went to college at 16. He was the son of an immigrant, and he was an Army brat. At the height of Jim Crow, he took on a college debate championship where he argued, and this was before Brown versus Board of Education, he argued and won the campus-wide debate that his university should admit black people to its graduate program. He was hired by one of the few law firms in Atlanta, Georgia that hired Jews back in the 1950s. And he went on to be a leading lay leader in the American Jewish Committee, the Anti-Defamation League, and he worked to fight and advance civil rights and human rights into his 9th decade. He was also an incredible lawyer in America, and he was a renowned attorney, and he had a roster of clients that was everything from Harley Davidson to Disney to the Indigo Girls to REM to Domino's Pizza, and I can't think of anything more American than that kind of client list. But above all, he inspired his 4 children to go into public service, teaching them that every generation faces a choice between fear and freedom, between law and power. And if we choose courage, if we defend the truth, if we uphold the rule of law, democracy won't just survive, it will thrive. And this man was my father. He was my father, Paige Alexander, and he lived to be 93, and he passed away 20 days ago today. So it's in his name that I am recommitted and rededicating myself to doing and fighting for the most important cause of our time, for the fight for the future of democracy in the United States. And Chautauqua, I truly feel this fight is worth fighting for. It's a fight we're going to win, and I look forward to fighting it with you. Thank you so much for listening to me, and I look forward to your questions.